Our last speaker for today is Dr. Karin Zotzmann. She's associate professor in applied linguistics at the University of Southampton, and her research interests include the conceptualization of intercultural competencies and learning in different conceptual domains and social domains, education and business and military, within the framework of transnational processes, the impact of social class on foreign language learning and teaching, a really big issue, I find, and the implications of internationalization and marketization of higher education on academic practices and inclusivity. And all of her research is informed by critical realism. So, Dr. Zotzmann, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's very early hours here and you've had a long day, so I'm really grateful for those who are still here. And I'm excited to talk to people in Japan, applied linguists and other critical realists from abroad. So the title of my talk is Critical Realism and Research on Student Self-Efficacy Beliefs. And my main objective is actually not to give an overview of a critical realism, because Jeremy and Dominic have already done so, but to exemplify the additional value critical realism can bring to research in applied linguistics. And I want to focus on self-efficacy beliefs in relation to academic writing. So the structure of my presentation is the following. I will give a brief outline of a quantitative study that I've done together with a colleague about self-efficacy beliefs, and it was a fairly traditional empiricist quantitative research that was only partly informed by critical realism. Then I will evaluate the benefits, but also the shortcomings of our quantitative study and explain why we designed a qualitative follow-up study based more on critical realism. And in the last part, I present some results of this study, which is still work in progress. I want to start by linking back to Jeremy's talk this morning, that research is indeed always based on philosophical assumptions, and this influences the concepts we use, but also our methodological choices. And ideally, these assumptions should be made explicit, but that is rarely the case because research, or not very often, because researchers normally operate in communities that do not only share, but also accept their epistemological and ontological perspectives. So here are some of the key tenets of critical realism, and you've already heard about them. I will not explain them, but I will refer to some of them, the ones in bold. So the study I want to report on is entitled Postgraduate Students' Beliefs About and Confidence for Academic Writing in the Field of Applied Linguistics. And we were motivated to investigate students' beliefs and experiences because we were concerned about many of our students who were struggling with academic writing. I have to explain that most of the students here in Southampton are from China, so they're non-UK students, but there are also other Asian students and a few from other countries. And we felt they struggled, not necessarily because of their general English, but because they were not familiar with the academic register in English, but also their own languages, and the many different assessment genres that we use here and more generally in the UK. So assessment genres include, for instance, small empirical studies, classroom discourse analysis, book reviews, textbook analysis, and many more. And what we do not have is multiple choice exams. And since this is what many of our students are used to from their previous educational experiences, they do not seem to feel in control and appear quite disoriented. And of course, we have support structures in place like pre-sessional EAP courses, but they're not discipline specific. And indeed, in our quantitative study, we found widespread uncertainty, especially in the first semester, which impacted students' self-efficacy beliefs and their grades negatively. So and there's a personal and rather profane reason for doing this research. I had never conducted a quantitative study before and wanted to experience firsthand whether my preconceptions were valid or ill-founded. Now let me go back one step and explain how our initial study, the quantitative study, was informed to a limited extent by critical realism. So we focused on, our concern was international students or non-UK students. And current research is highly critical of the assumption we made, namely that individuals can be categorized into groups, home versus international students. So researchers from postmodern and post-structuralist perspectives criticize that this dichotomizing view, home versus international students, is valid. They think it's socially constructed, and we agree. And it comes along normally with implicit or explicit evaluations. So home students are commonly regarded as the normal group, whereas international students are somehow problematic and deficient. And studies from these perspectives often aim to show how capable international students are, how they and the academics they interact with cross and disregard boundaries, how they co-construct and negotiate practices and identities, and how they make use of multilingual resources or translanguaging, and thereby outperform monolinguals. So in our study, we had no intention to homogenize and evaluate groups based on their nationality. And neither did we want to make any claims as to whether international students are more or less resourceful than others. And yes, assessment genres are not necessarily evident to so-called home students either. So they might struggle in their transition from school to university or from undergraduate to postgraduate studies. Nevertheless, we were concerned about the strong emphasis on identity, negotiability, and fluidity of boundaries in postmodern and post-structuralist research, and the concomitant marginalization of structures, power relations, and their causal effects. And here our study was informed by critical realism's emphasis on structures and agency. So in the first instance, students, international or otherwise, are not commonly in the position where they can or allowed to negotiate and change assessment practices or criteria. These are structures that pre-exist them and they enter into them when they come into the institution. In addition to this, while postmodern and post-structuralist approaches rightly so reject the idea of deficiency of international students, they often flip to the other extreme and argue that international students or ELF speakers are all highly competent users and not learners of English. So we rejected both generalizations, the idea that all students are deficient or the idea that all students are highly competent. Ultimately, we thought individuals differ. We did assume, though, that all international students who are for the first time in the UK went through a transition process between structures, for instance, from one educational level to the next, undergraduate to postgraduate, from one educational system like the Chinese or the Saudi system to the UK system, from one set of assessment genres to the next, or to another, and from studying in their first language to studying in English. And this links back to what Jeremy said at the beginning, although I was still asleep at that time. The assumption in interpretivist research that human agents can create their worlds entirely from scratch without considering structural constraints and enablements, including those provided by language. That is highly problematic. So we'll now come to self-efficacy beliefs and why they are important. So perceived self-efficacy is defined as a sort of internal control system, as people's beliefs about their capabilities to produce designated levels of performance, for instance, in assessment, that exercise influence over events that affect their lives. Assessment does affect their lives, yeah? The grades affect their life chances. Self-efficacy beliefs determine how people feel, think, motivate themselves, and behave. So why are they important? Because self-efficacy beliefs have causal effects on learning. So for instance, higher confidence may facilitate people to apply even more effort. They're in the zone, so to say. They set themselves challenging goals and they might surpass their normal performance because they're in the zone. They feel empowered. Conversely, if you have lower levels of self-confidence and particular beliefs about academic writing, may lead to underperformance, which in turn lowers levels of confidence and then negatively affects performance. So in other words, students with good grades and feedback can excel because it motivates them, and students with whose confidence is low might become worse because they become basically frustrated. I will now come to our study, and like previous research on self-efficacy beliefs that is mostly quantitative, we designed a questionnaire and used statistical analysis. Overall, 122 students participated from across 17 universities in the UK. I will not go into the details of our questionnaire now, but we included items about these areas more or less. But what is important here is that we distinguished between beliefs about academic writing that are beliefs that academic writing is mainly a transmission of ideas. So you think that you basically have to report on what the authorities say. There are ideas out there that you have to report on, and that is all that writing involves. Whereas a transaction beliefs, first of all, has an emotional aspect and an identity aspect. It involves an engagement with your own ideas while you write, while you develop your own voice, but it also, and this is related to recursion, it means engaging with an audience, and it involves a cyclical process of writing, revision, and editing. So, sorry, I think these are the results of our study, some of the results, but I think the most important result of our study was that beliefs about writing as a transactional process, so involving yourself and others to clarify ideas, is more beneficial in the UK context. And holding the belief that writing is a transmission of ideas is less beneficial, so it will lead to lower grades. We always have to look at the context where these beliefs are beneficial or not beneficial. So in the UK context, the idea that writing is a transmission of ideas is probably less beneficial. But it is a belief that most of our students hold because of their previous experiences with assessment. For instance, they do multiple choice tests or other forms of assessment where the transmission of ideas is important. Therefore, they might achieve lower grades in the UK, and consequently, their self-efficacy beliefs might decrease. And this is aggravated because they might compare themselves with their past selves and possibly more successful students, and also with their peers who might fare better or worse, or they might not compare themselves. It depends on the personality. Now, let us now look at how we wrote the results of our study in empiricist language. And that's important because we did an empiricist study and we wanted it to get published. So we use terms like writing is inferred to be potentially beneficial. It could be inferred, it is associated with, and other terms like A correlates with B, associated with, or the word link or predict is quite prevalent in empiricist research. So why is that? So I don't know if my presenters have, the other presenters have already explained it, but empiricism is a philosophical theory that was developed by David Hume and other philosophers in the 18th century. And their view was basically that we can only create knowledge about through observation of what is empirically available to us. So any kind of data that we can collect that is measurable or that is there is the only way that we can construct knowledge, whereas critical realism thinks that empirical data is only one aspect of reality that we should look at. So Hume argued that when observable things co-occur frequently and regularly, then there must be a causal relation behind it. So a universal law, as the regular co-occurrence cannot be happening by pure accident. So this is the theory of constant conjunctions. So what empiricists do in a world where everything is interconnected and causally related is they try to hold variables constant and isolate them, for instance, in a test or in a laboratory environment, which is basically a closed environment, not an open environment like reality. And or they use questionnaires as we did. And then they try to find quantifiable regularities or correlations between isolated variables. And that is exactly what we did as well. Try to isolate variables and see whether they associate with each other, whether they correlate, and whether we can predict something in our research. But empiricism also has an ideological aspect, I would say. It is often regarded as real research because it involves statistics. So anything that doesn't involve statistics is not real research. And this applies, by the way, not only to empiricist approaches to self-efficacy beliefs, but also many other topics in applied linguistics. So here we have an example from generative second language research, where the author outlines that to be termed scientific, a method of inquiry must be based on empirical and measurable evidence and subject to specific principles of reasoning, and so on and so forth. And then she says later, in order to test a prediction, we have to obtain quantifiable data, either longitudinal or or cross-sectionally, and we need control groups and to test our hypothesis and to validate our test instruments. Now, empirical evidence and statistics are very important, but we need to understand what they can and cannot do. So in the first instance, correlations do not equal causality. And every statistician is actually aware of that. Secondly, statistics and empirical evidence by themselves have no explanatory power if you don't have an appropriate theory that goes beyond what is empirically observable and explain why phenomena tend to occur. So what are the real causes of causal powers that drive the empirical surface behavior or phenomena? And that is what critical realism can bring in. So what did our quantitative study tell us? It told us that our participants, the international students who made a transition, indeed had lower grades than the home students. They also had lower grades than they had before. And they more often believed that writing is a transmission of ideas, not a transaction or recursion. And that this belief had a negative impact on average on their self-efficacy beliefs. And then low self-efficacy beliefs in turn can have a detrimental effect on learning. So this research points us to potential causal configuration, but it can also mislead us, especially when we look at individual cases. In other words, they're not universal laws, but they are demi-regularities, so a tendency on average in a population, but not necessarily a causal configuration that affects each and every individual to the same extent. So as the other presenters have already explained while I was still sleeping, from a CR perspective, critical realism perspective, we have to assume that human agents are reflexive, and they operate in relatively open but nevertheless pre-structured social systems. Individuals therefore necessarily differ in terms of how they respond to these contexts. But they are also, to some extent, their beliefs and resources and powers are also constrained by the structures they enter into. Moreover, self-efficacy is causally effective alongside other psychological, social, and cultural factors, so it is multidimensional. Students' motivation and ability to learn and transform are causally effective, and so are their degree of perseverance and resilience. Their learning and writing strategies, the time they invest, and the support network they can draw upon. So we tried to capture many of these quantitative factors in our quantitative study, but when we interviewed students, we found enormous differences between them. So in our qualitative study, we still assume that all students made a transition between structures. So again, from one university system to another, one set of assessment genres to another, one language and one educational degree to another. So while all interviews made a transition and encountered similar structures in the UK, we wanted to find out whether and how they differed. So let us look at one student where the results of our quantitative study coincided to a large extent actually with her trajectory. So student A unfortunately failed most of her assignments. And because her self-efficacy beliefs were low, she also withdrew from social interaction with fellow students. And by not engaging with others, she felt she was the only student who struggled and developed mental health issues. Now, that was a very sad case. With the help of enabling services and tutors, etc., she fortunately recovered and was able to resubmit her assignments and graduated, but it was a year after her cohort. Now, student A had clearly experienced writing as a transmission in her degree program in China, and she felt that the UK system was decidedly different. But even though she was aware of the difference, she didn't, between the assessment genres, she didn't quite understand how they differed exactly. She felt that that teachers' explanations, for instance, were clear at the beginning, but then when she started to write, so that is when she began to actually struggle. They were not specific enough. And as I found out later, she also started her writing really late and was then not able to go back to her tutors and ask for further explanations. Student A also had a problem, like most of our students, with criticality. If you want to achieve a distinction in your assignment, one of the criteria is that you have to have a critical perspective. But what does that mean? So writing criticality for her meant stating her opinion, but that's unfortunately not exactly what it means. It's having an informed discussion. And if you state your opinion, and your personal opinion, instead of drawing on arguments and aligning yourself in an informed discussion, having this belief about academic writing can be detrimental to your grade. Another issue was that when she and other students had, in the group of Chinese students, she said they asked each other and not the tutor or perhaps EAP instructor, so they remained inside the group. And most worryingly, and this is something we hadn't considered in our quantitative study, is that she didn't seem to invest much time in writing. So she said, well, maybe 2 days before the deadline, because I'm very lazy sometimes. So in some, student A fell to a large extent into the profile that emerged from our student. She believed that academic writing involves transmission. She wasn't and did not really become familiar with assessment genres, only a year later. And the only support system she had was fellow Chinese students. She had low grades, low confidence, and all this resulted in a vicious circle. She started to withdraw, thus learned less from others, which in turn resulted again in lower grades and lower self-efficacy beliefs. So we have an effect that becomes a cause here and works back on the causal configuration. So even though student A was somehow a paradigmatic example of the demi-regularity we found in the quantitative study, her individual case also displayed some characteristics that we couldn't capture other than through the qualitative interview. So her case showed causal configurations that went beyond it. So for instance, that she considered herself to be very lazy. So again, from a critical realist perspective, we have to take agency into account, and agency in turn is based, at least in part, on reflexivity, also on structures, resources, and powers, but agency can also be defined as reflexivity in relation to context. So at the individual level, okay, the phenomena is actually so complex and occurs in an open system that neither the variables nor the exact relationship between the variables is fully definable. So empiricist research draws attention away from the causal configuration because it necessarily ignores individual differences and the fact that causal errors do not always point in one direction. Being lazy, as the student described herself, made her fall behind other students, which led to social isolation and then impacted on self-efficacy beliefs, and that worked back on the lack of her success. Now, I will show you interview data from 2 more students to exemplify how big the differences between individuals were. Student C was an excellent student in his home country, something he shared with many other international students. And he also reported that the assessment in his home country in his undergraduate degree was very different from the one in the UK. Like student A, he struggled enormously, but he noticed quite early on differences between the assessment, the sets of assessment in the different institutions. So he noticed that he had to sound convincing and academic, but also that his draft had to be revised many times. So he had more transaction and recursion perspective on writing. He also didn't find like student A, the explanations terribly clear. So there were some similarities with student A, but student C differed from A. In A, he became quickly aware of the differences between the systems, right at the beginning of the first semester. And although he reported a lot of stress during that time, he worked a lot and he was resilient and kept asking questions. More importantly, he was very resourceful. He kept searching for answers and made friends with PhD students. As he says here, master students were very familiar in what they know and what they do not know. They were just confused and had the same questions as I do. Asking more experienced students was what ultimately helped him. So student C did suffer in the first semester, but he was able to achieve good grades through a lot of work and through networking with other students who had more experience with academic writing in the UK system. So let me come to the last student, student D. She was highly successful, meaning she achieved high grades right from the beginning of her MA degree in the UK. She was also a successful team player and aware that having a network of fellow students, colleagues, and mentors and proofreaders would be an efficient way to achieve good grades. What made a huge difference in her case, though, was that she had background knowledge in genre theory from her previous degree and could identify what the potential obstacles and problems were. So for her, in this excerpt of the interview, she had an empowering insight in a class in her home context. So she said, they talked about genres and she says, okay, now I understand what it is. And yes, I was aware that there are different types, that the same type differs also in different language contexts and different cultural contexts. But we knew that explicitly. So I've given you 3 examples of very different causal configurations and very different factors that played a role for individual students. Now let me come back to the relation between our empiricist study and critical realism. So from a critical realist perspective, it is wrong that statistics and correlation analysis is real research, whereas qualitative research is soft and subjective. Statistics is just one among many ways of constructing knowledge about the world, and it depends on our project whether it is useful and relevant. So for us, it was relevant because we wanted to find out what the demi-regularities were. But we didn't assume that numbers explain anything by themselves. You need a theory that explains causal relationships that go beyond what is empirically available to us and what is frequent and regular on the surface level. Therefore, we designed the work in progress qualitative study. Now, does that mean that we end up with just individual cases in critical realism? Now, doesn't. It was important for us to do a quantitative analysis to find out that non-UK students, on average, indeed struggled with academic writing and on average had lower grades. And for us, it was also important to find out that one of the issue, on average, was that students held beliefs informed by their previous educational experience, beliefs about academic writing that tended towards the transmission of ideas instead of transactions. So do critical realists run regressions? Well, Douglas Popper has a chapter in his book on the reconstructed sociology about whether or not qualitative research is quantitative research has a place in critical realism. And he basically says that 3 levels in a causal analysis. So you have to identify and describe causal mechanisms and powers. And I think conceptually we have done that prior to our quantitative study. Then we have to invoke those causal mechanisms that we have identified in narrative accounts of contingent causal conjunctures. And that's what we didn't do in our quantitative study. And that's why we had to do a qualitative follow-up study. So it's the narrative account, not the equations, the correlations, that actually gives us a bigger picture of causal configurations, basically. And this is where we are right now. What we haven't done yet, and this is something that Dominic has shown us how to do it, is the 3rd level, which is retroduction. And retroduction is basically a reflexive and critical engagement with our own conceptual and theoretical framework in relation to alternative explanations or narratives. So our qualitative study is still work in progress. We have some indicators of what goes on for individuals, but we haven't engaged in this retroductive exercise of what kind of explanations would help us to make sense of these different causal configurations. So having said that, I just would like to, this is my last slide, so I would like to go back to our why we actually started our research. And this was our concern about the difficulties some of our students face and the emotional and academic consequences this had. And this concern is actually quite typical for critical realism, that ultimately aims for improvement and change of social practices. So personally, I can say that based on what we have done so far, I have learned things that I wasn't that aware of before we did the study. So even though I talked a lot with my students about academic writing and the expectations and the challenges it represents when they're novice writers in my class, I now also make students very aware of how important collaboration with other students is. And I form groups in the classroom so they can go outside of the classroom and continue their discussions with other students. So I create opportunities for them to engage group work. It's always difficult for students to really get to know and engage with other students, so to make contact outside informally. So I try to provide them in class with a structure for that. Among other things, I ask them to exchange sections of their drafts. So they switch between the reader and writer perspective and thus gain awareness of audience. And in addition to this, I try not to give them assessment options or not too many assessment options. And I know this sounds counterintuitive because different assessment types in one module could actually cater for individual differences. But what I have learned from this study is the more options you give them, the less students know about one option and the less time you as an instructor have to explain one of these options. If you give them one option, you have more time and they have more time to engage in it. So this is the end of my presentation. I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, but I think you're probably all tired after a long day. So I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Zotzmann. Please, questions. Jeremy, please.
Yeah, sorry to go first there. I'm a presenter. I probably shouldn't be speaking. If there's anybody else who wants to go before me, maybe. Okay.
I don't see anyone, so please.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Karin, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It's really, really lucid, very, very clear. There's one thing I would like to say about both Dominic's presentation and Karin's presentations, that both of them have demonstrated very clearly one of the core element of critical realist research in action, which is that critical realism is essentially very much concerned with conflationary thinking, or determinist sort of interpretations of things. So for example, the effect of language learning material on the learning of a language, for example, or the impact of culture on perceptions of criticality, for example. And so I think most scientists, social scientists, are quite aware that those kinds of deterministic accounts are insufficient. Unfortunately, this is what we find in a lot of research out there, is that we know that this is wrong, but we actually do it because of space constraints, because of a range of different reasons, because we don't actually understand fully the data that we have at our disposal. And I think that Dominic and Karin have demonstrated clearly that from a critical realist perspective, what do researchers actually have to do to avoid deterministic conclusions? What is involved in going deep into your data and trying to unpack it? And what does it mean to explain the reality of learners as human beings in relation to culture and social structure, those different layers that are involved? And so I just want to mention that you know, this is the biggest impression I got from Karin's and Dominic's presentation, is that they've done this very, very well. There's also just one more comment that I'd like to make about Karin's presentation. When I read about student A's situation and student C's reality, I just really felt echoes from a book by Margaret Archer in 2012, when she talks about UK students, and she talks about her 4 different types of reflexivities: communicative, autonomous, meta, and fractured. So I wondered if you had anything to say about perhaps these students' types of reflexivity, not reflexivity in a very broad sense, but really in a very kind of more detailed way.
Is this directed to both of us or
to
just
you,
me?
Karin?
Oh, okay. I'm actually quite hesitant. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm quite hesitant to use Archer's differentiation between the 4 types of reflexivity. It makes some intuitive sense to me, but I'm not entirely sure that people can be categorized in these 4 different types. I think it has to do with their experience, and they can change, and possibly Archer wouldn't deny that. Actually, she says that the type of reflexivity that is foregrounded in a specific situation, it also depends on the situation and the context. So so yes and no, I know about it, but I'm actually more inclined not to talk about reflexivity, but experiences or habitual experiences that can get in the way of you feeling in control of the situation. So I think going to another country for the first time in your life and having to write academically in a different language, you have to learn everything about, you know, you have to learn so much and relearn so much and unlearn so much about so many aspects. You know, I didn't bring examples from other students, but they talked about the adaptations they had to make in their social life, being alone, having to cook for themselves, and that actually impacted their academic performance. So yes, you are right, there's this concept of, you know, meta-reflexive, communicative reflexive, etc. in Archer, but I'm hesitant to use it for this kind of project.
Well, there's always a danger whenever categorizing people, is you do violence to their reality, right? So, yeah.
Any other questions? One thing, and I'm not sure if you saw, this is just a comment, I'm not sure if you saw it in the chat, but your data that you were talking about reminded me a lot of an LCT study. I put it in the chat. Rainbow Chen, she's a student. She was she's actually now a professor in Taiwan, but she was a student, I believe, at University of Sydney or Macquarie, I'm not sure. But she did work with data from students with from PRC, and found a snippet, a code clash working with LCT, so in specialization codes, where the students were coming from a tradition where they expected a transmission mode, and where they was into this constructivist mode, and they described a lot of what you just said about this as this not knowing what was expected in the assignments.
Yes.
And being totally confused by that, and not really feeling that they're, one of the conclusions I recall from her study, I believe I looked at her PhD, was that the students actually they actually felt that they did not actually learn anything, that it was not valid as a learning experience. Anyway, I put the author, the paper that she co-authored with Carl Mayton in the chat, but you can find some more. But anyway, if you're continuing to look, this might be an interesting perspective, parallel to the work that you're doing on a similar phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely. I also find the theory of semantic waves extremely important in this respect. Yeah. How do you, as a teacher, teach, and how does that relate into academic writing? Thank you very much, Thomas. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? It is 5:30. We've been at this for 4 hours now. So, and Karin, it's still early morning there. So it's about time for your coffee, I guess. But if that's all, there's no more questions, I'm going to say thank you very much to Dr. Karin Zotzmann for your talk. Thank you again to Dominic Hetzel. Thank you again to Jeremy Bouchard for your presentations today. Please round of applause. Okay, we've lost a few people over the course of the day, but you know, we're the folks who are hanging on. But I'm sure everyone appreciates it, and thank you very much. And everyone who will be able to watch this on YouTube, thanks to you kindly consenting to let us share this there, will appreciate your insights.